Doesn't the title like stay under the lender technically, like until it's paid off?
No, the
I know we're
mortgage, no,
well,
you're thinking like
yeah,
a
I guess.
car loan, a lease to own with a car. So
Okay.
the seller in a subto transaction has no further ownership or control over that property. You cannot expect a title company or attorney to have the paperwork that you need for a subto transaction to live beyond closing date, to survive and be viable. Alex, what's going on, man?
So I got this deal in Alabama right now, pretty new to subject to. We have been wholesaling for a few years, but really just focus on all cash deals. And then
Right.
just recently, we're not even trying to get sub two deals. We're just kind of throwing it out there for, stuff that doesn't make sense cash. And, we've
Right.
gotten a few lately. So I had a
Nice.
buyer today ask me like, hey, what happens if the seller tries to refinance? Since the servicing, like they still have access to that after the transaction is complete. So he's asking about that. He was concerned about what happens if the seller like goes into bankruptcy, like what's going to happen? Is that going to affect him at all? So it was just all these questions that started coming up, and I was like, "Ooh, I have no idea." We've literally just been doing an addendum in the contract that says this property is being purchased subject to the existing financing, and escrow just does all their normal stuff, and they figure out some way to continue paying the mortgage. So very like wild, wild west sub two
Cowboy,
deals.
yeah.
And yeah, we're not. I tell
Which and
everyone too, like, hey, I'm not a sub two expert. Like, I've got this deal. If you want
yeah,
to buy it. But you guys handle all that through escrow.
right. And those people would typically hire us if you didn't, right? So for my team, Creative TC Transaction Consultants, we bring the right paperwork. You cannot expect a title company or attorney to have the paperwork that you need for a subto transaction to live beyond closing date, to survive and be viable. Things can go wrong all over the place, and the buyer needs a power of attorney among a pile of other documents. You guys need to turn to us. The other thing is, I've seen other transaction coordinators who have the list of documents, fill them out willy nilly, and send them in and say, "I've done my job. Give me $1,000." And we've had to do cleanup because they didn't do a good job. They didn't. Just because you have a template doesn't mean you've got the deal done right. So when you do it, you have been doing it Wild West, and I, that stuff works
Definitely
until it
have.
doesn't. And that's the other thing is like with some of the transaction coordinators that I've run into, it works until it doesn't. When they run into a problem, oh, I don't know what to do about that. Sorry, not my problem. I did my part. Yeah, you coordinated, you didn't consult. So the pricing difference should tell you. The the thing with the refinance, the only person that can refinance a property is the owner. When you buy sub two, then but the buyer becomes the owner of title officially.
Doesn't the title like stay under the lender technically, like until it's paid off?
No, the
Like, I know we're
mortgage, no,
well,
you're thinking like
yeah,
a
I guess,
car loan, a lease to own with a car. That
yeah,
doesn't
I don't
transfer it.
know.
So if you do a contract for deed or executory contract of some sort, then the title remains with the person with the seller until you finish your contractual obligations, at which time they transfer title to you. That's purchase on a contract for deed, which is a form of seller finance. However, a sub two
Yeah, we're
is
not
an
doing that.
actual full transfer of title. Just like a seller finance, an actual seller finance with a promissory note and a mortgage and all that actually transfers title to the buyer, and they have full ownership and control at the closing date. So
Okay.
the seller in a subto transaction has no further ownership or control over that property. You need the right paperwork to indicate that they no longer have control over the mortgage either, because they should not interfere, because that can get expensive for the buyer if they have to deal with a due on sale. Typically that won't happen, but if somebody goes doing stupid stuff or gets uppity and wants to call it in and request that it be called due on sale because they agreed to all these terms and now they just don't want it on their credit anymore, well, part of the benefit of selling sub two is you get something that you couldn't get elsewhere. We're buying the property from you, taking this mortgage off your hands, catching up the arrears, making sure your payments are made on time, allowing you to move on, whatever it is that we're doing, higher price. There's some trade-off, and you made a deal. This was a benefit to you. You can't renege later, and we need a contract that survives close of escrow, a paperwork and forms and all those things, disclosures, acknowledgments that survive close of escrow to manage that relationship until that mortgage is either refinanced or paid off by who? The buyer, because the buyer owns
Gotcha.
and
Okay.
controls the asset and the mortgage.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I've heard of that. And I know we have not been taking care of those contracts in the last couple of deals we've done. So I
Sure.
feel bad. I want to like go back to the buyers and be like, hey, let's make sure we tighten some of this stuff up. If that's even possible, it might be too late. I don't
Yeah,
know.
if
But
it depends on what's, and having a good entry with a good contract that says you're going to have to sign this. These are the forms, Mr. Seller. When you sign this purchase contract from me, you are also agreeing that you're going to fill out this disclosure, this. You acknowledge that the credit stays in your name, that A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So we've got a pretty comprehensive addendum that needs to go with it so that it's enforceable as a purchase contract. It's like it should not be a surprise at the closing table. And I'll say this straight up on a video. I think it's straight up douchebaggery to get a sales contract and save the subto addendum until close of escrow. You're dropping bombs on people and it's too late for them to turn back. They've already got moving trucks. They've already done all the things. And now you're getting them in a week, not you, because I haven't seen what you do, but I've seen people do this, and it's straight up douchebaggery to not make sure that the seller understands the full transaction that they're getting into, and then just to say, oh, somebody else will take care of it, and they won't have time to react at close of escrow. Straight trash bag move. Don't do that, people. You need to get the right contract up front. You need to get the full disclosures up front to indicate, yes, they understand what sort of deal they're getting into, especially if you're going to assign that deal to somebody else. You want that to be an enforceable contract. And if they
yeah,
don't know what they're getting into, yeah,
we're definitely clear about like what subject to means. And we tell
sure.
them like, hey, this is staying in your name. We're going to
Yep.
make the payments. We're transferring title, like all of that stuff for sure. We're fully transparent on, but I think where we're lacking is the documentation of like
Yeah.
how that's going to work. And like you said, surviving escrow. So just to be clear, bankruptcy, if the seller goes into bankruptcy, since it's under a new buyer on title, it's not going to have any effect whatsoever.
Right. I won't say no effect whatsoever, but if there's an order and if it's included, it should be excluded from the bankruptcy because you can demonstrate that somebody else is responsible for that mortgage. They, number one, they no longer own the asset. They don't have any ownership or control over the house. Number one. Number two, yes, the mortgage is in their name and it's on their credit. However, it is current, it's being paid, and somebody else is responsible for it. And it would be injurious to the other party for that to be included in the bankruptcy.
Right. I don't see that how that would help somebody anyway. So okay.
Right.
I mean, tell me more about like what kind of services you guys offer. Obviously, we haven't used any kind of like subto TC. We just
Yeah.
have an in-house TC that does our normal, wholesale deals and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, and that's where I would say the difference is between a transaction coordinator and a transaction consultant. So I built a team of consultants because we've been through the things. I tweak documents consistently. Like we're doing deals all over the country. So this attorney likes this addendum. This attorney likes this addendum. They're both kind of similar and overlap, but they both have gaps. And I blend those and bring them into all the transactions. So I have a whole slew of documents that are unpublished because they're the best of the best. And I got to keep my edge, So we consult on deals, and that means we understand the implications of different situations. I'm talking today, I was talking about a novation deal, and a seller is refusing to allow the buyer renovator, and sorry, a novation is an agreement to rehab and sell. So it
Yeah,
doesn't
we do
transfer
this.
title. The would-be buyer is just a rehabber who saves closing costs. They come in, they bring their rehab budget, do the work, and then they put it on the MLS and get to choose who the buyer is, in a nutshell. The seller would not agree in this case to allow a lien to be placed on the property to protect the buyer renovator's money and contractor expenses. And I'm like, that's a major risk, because if they renege, right, you're going to get power of attorney from that seller. But guess what? A power of attorney person always, as long as they're in a right state of mind, has the ability and the authority to revoke their POA. Even if it's in contradiction to a contract that they have with you, they have the sole and absolute right to reverse and rescind your power of attorney. Sorry about it. So the problem is, if she won't sign to place a lien, an explicit agreement to allow you to place a lien, your money is unprotected, and she can renege and you can be out all that money. That's a risk. Now, what I want you to do as my client is make an informed decision. I'm not going to make the decision for you. I'm not going to negotiate on your behalf. I will explain things to you and everybody else and their mom and go do research and bring that stuff back. But as a consultant, my job is to make sure you're provided all the information you need to make quality, informed decisions.
Sure. I
And
got
that's the
that.
difference.
We do novation, but it's just wholesale novation, not something we're rehabbing ourselves. But
Yeah.
I'm
You can
definitely
wholesale those contracts,
interested.
But having the paperwork done the right way the first time is also really important. Like I've had to draft an addendum to purchase contract for novations, like who's paying for utilities and how, who's paying for the mortgage and how, when do they vacate? Do they have to? Do they have to just take over a portion of the house? Does the buyer have to bring new insurance policy to cover the renovations? Like there's a lot of things that nobody else is addressing right now. And it's scary to me on behalf of everybody else. I come from cybersecurity, so risk management is like me.
Sure. Yeah, I get that. So to talk about those services specifically for just processing a subto transaction, is that something you want to do offline? Is that something we can have a conversation about here? Or
Yeah, I'm
how
happy
would we
to here.
proceed if we want to do that? Okay. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, if you want to, whatever you're comfortable with, you want to talk about pricing and just basically what we would need to provide and how much hands-on or hands-off we can be on that. I think
Yeah.
that's what we would need to know to make a decision.
Yeah, I like it. So we typically are broken into two phases. The first phase is the contract phase. Until you have a signed contract, there's no deal to manage, right? We're transaction managers and consultants. So if you're going to go get a contract signed and it's a subto, you need your subto addendum. You need a sufficient contract and addendum, both signed, and then we can take off from there. So if you're doing that first phase, then we start transaction management from there forward, and we'll take it to the closing table for you, bringing the right title company, the right people, the right paperwork, and managing that escrow. If you don't have the contractor, you've got a verbal close, right? You've already got it. They've agreed to all the terms and conditions. You've got a bullet point list of what you're going to do. You can give the address and all the contact info. We have contracts we can pre-fill for you so that you can send, and we can also do a seller walkthrough to explain and do some overcoming objections. There's a fine threshold there. If you've got a solid close, verbal close, then we're good. It's just signing paperwork, answering a couple questions. If you don't have a solid verbal close, then it's more like we're going to convert into JV territory because we're closing the deal for you. So our contract services on the front end range from $150 to $350, depending upon the timeline and whether or not you need a seller walkthrough at this time. Transaction management starts at $1,000, but we also treat it in our contract as a closing cost. Therefore, if you're assigning it, you can assign it to you have to pay an upfront fee for us to start work on it. We take half upfront, and then the remainder is due at close of escrow. So we don't get paid our second half if you don't close, which means we like to do deals that we think are going to close. And then you should be reimbursed your first half at close of escrow from your end buyer if you're assigning.
Okay. We've definitely got it under contract already with like a subject to disclosure or addendum in there, but it's probably not the right contract. Like it's not your contract that I'm sure you would want to work with.
Yeah,
so is that something that you'd be willing to provide?
Yeah, if you've got a deal under contract in particular, we can do amendments pretty easy. Because getting the first signatures is really important. I prefer to have it on the right paperwork, but we can also work with it. We'll triage. People will send us contracts. We don't automatically accept all deals. We're going to review it and triage it and say, I don't think this is a solid deal. We either need to rewrite this contract and start over, or it's pretty close. We can tweak it with addendums and we're good to go.
Okay.
I also tend to avoid probate.
Yeah, me too. I probably wouldn't bring you anything unless it was already under contract and I had a buyer like assigned already.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I don't want to pay you $500 unless I've already, got money on the table. So
that's right. And I don't want to take a deal. I'm hesitant to take on a deal that I don't think is going to close, because I don't want, we don't issue refunds as a policy for work that we perform. And then I don't, then it makes me feel bad that you had a deal that fell apart and paid for it.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, I think that's really all the questions that I had. I'll talk to our team and our buyer and see if it's something that they are comfortable with moving forward with, and then we can kind of go from there.
Super. Okay. Thanks, man.
Awesome, man. Appreciate your time.